So many years of catastrophe, more than 6 million refugees. It could be you and your family, forced from your home and your histories.
We are the people, and this is our time. Stand up, sing out for Palestine.
Welcome. This is Palestine Today, and I'm your host, Kathleen Wells, a radio program dedicated to news about Palestine. And my co-host, British journalist and campaign filmmaker, is going to join us. He wasn't with us last week because some snafu with Egypt and everything going on in the Middle East. It's chaotic, I would like to say. So Palestine Today brings you the unfiltered truth where you will get nowhere else in the mainstream media. That's right, nowhere else except here, and also another station. And our first guest is the host of that station. But before we talk about my first guest, I'd like to bring on Harry and say, welcome, Harry. Thank you for joining me today on Palestine Today.
I'm happy to be back, and I apologize to the loyal listeners for putting up with my absence for a couple of weeks. I've been very busy both in Gaza and in Egypt. And as you said, the situation here is extremely complex and complicated, and I hope that I'll have a minute or two to talk about that in a few moments.
Yes, definitely. But before we talk about the chaotic situation in the Middle East and specifically in Egypt and Gaza, I want to tell you about our first guest in the first segment. His name is Jeff Blankfort. He's a frequent guest on my show, on my Wednesday show. He's a Middle East analyst, and he has his own show, Takes on the World, for KZXY, the public radio station on radio station of Mendocino County of California. But before we bring Jeff on, I'd like you, Harry, to update us about what you've been experiencing in Egypt and in Gaza the last couple of weeks.
Well, unfortunately, it sounds almost poetic, but it's true that the Palestinians have been among the first to suffer from the complex situation developing in Egypt. And spending now 3 weeks in Egypt trying to better understand the situation, it's clear that the society here is generally totally polarized with regard to what has happened. At the beginning of July, Mohamed Morsi, who was democratically elected in generally considered free and fair elections last year, was ousted. And since then, dozens have been killed and injured in clashes, and it's not absolutely speaking objectively clear who was responsible for these deaths and injuries. The best estimation says that it was heavy-handedness on the part of the security forces coupled with readiness for violence by some of those that were injured or attacked or killed. And most of those were supporters of the ousted president or of his Muslim Brotherhood movement. So some here see it as a totally illegitimate military coup. Others see it as a re-revolution with an ousting which was legitimate based on an increase in swelling dissatisfaction with Morsi's first year, his inability to deal with the poor economic situation, as well as to deal with security issues, particularly in the volatile Sinai region, which is, of course, right next to Gaza. And this also then feeds into the general situation of how Palestinians, or particularly Hamas, is seen in Egypt. Generally speaking, people are extremely hostile to Hamas, and there is also a great deal of poor sentiment towards Palestinians in general. So many Egyptians cite Palestinian terrorists coming through the tunnels into Egypt and causing a security situation in the Sinai Desert. But many don't specify that those are militants. They just say Palestinians in general. So there is also a kind of propaganda, particularly in the middle-class dominated media, mainstream media here in Egypt. There is almost a campaign against Palestinians. I've asked dozens of Egyptians what they think about the military taking over, the potential problems with accountability, because they're obviously not elected, they don't have a particular clear democratic mandate, and also actually is the military neutral, and in what interest will the military act in this interim period? And many here believe the military is on the side of the people, that there are no real questions with regard to the intentions or the neutrality of the military, even despite the millions of US dollars given from the US to the military to prop it up. So it's very, very complicated. And initially, I think people find it very hard to understand how so many Egyptians support the ousting and support this apparent military takeover. But spending time here, I'm starting to see how so many Egyptians do see it, they are absolutely dissatisfied with Morsi's first year, regardless of whether he was elected or not, think that he was bringing the country down and that had to be stopped prematurely before another natural election term. And so it's very complicated. Now, since he was ousted at the beginning of July, the border with Gaza has been restricted now so that only internationals and humanitarian emergencies can get in and out. And so the numbers of those traversing the border are right down to a couple or a few hundred per day. Generally, people in Gaza are suffering from what appears to be a very serious resource shortage, particularly affecting fuel because of the border closure and because primarily also of the Egyptian security forces, the military in the Sinai, demolishing almost all of what was left of the smuggling tunnels traversing the border, for which Palestinians in Gaza rely for most of their consumable goods on that import, that sort of black market import measure. And so it's very seriously affecting Palestinians in Gaza, and it doesn't look like things are going to get better in regard of the smuggling or in regard of the legitimate land crossing anytime soon. As for regards for Egypt, it's also not clear exactly how things are going to develop. The Muslim Brotherhood obviously is extremely angry about the ousting of their president, as they see it, and there is a readiness to resist physically or violently the crackdown on their protests to see their president reinstated. So that's the general situation in Egypt and Gaza right now.
Yeah, it's very complicated. I've been reading the various points of views. Last week I had on the show Hisham Hagag Ami, who is an Egyptian who supported the ousting of President Morsi, and he expressed, I'd like to have him on the program again on my Wednesday show or this show, he expressed the desire, the necessity to close the Gaza border, that it must be done because, as you had mentioned, that many Egyptians feels that terrorists are being smuggled into Egypt via that border, via the tunnels.
It's difficult to fully comprehend in the beginning this claim that weapons and terrorists are being smuggled out of Gaza into the Sinai for conflict in Egypt, because most people think, well, the weapons are trying to get into Gaza to fight the Israelis. But actually, no, there is this very, very widespread belief that weapons are coming out of Gaza through the tunnels, as are militants, and causing instability in the Sinai, which is seen as really a very volatile zone. And many Egyptians feel that if the situation in the Sinai is not properly clamped down on now, that they will lose the Sinai to whatever hostile forces might want to take it away. So from the general Egyptian point of view, the Sinai is something extremely significant, and they're very sensitive about the situation there, and that's one of the main drivers for the border closure.
Mm-hmm. And also in the States, there was just recently, I think it was announced yesterday, that there is a terrorism alert, that many embassies have been closed because of concern about terrorism. So we're on high alert. Well, let me bring on Jeff Blankfort now to touch on this, and also the peace talks that are going on that have resumed due to the efforts of Secretary of State John Kerry last Monday has now resume peace talks between Israel and Palestine. But before we go to the peace talks, let me ask Jeff. Hi, Jeff. What are your feelings about this issue, what's going on in Egypt and the border closing in Gaza?
Well, the Egyptian situation defines complications. It defines the word complex. What it seems that it happened is that there are many people at fault, but there is evidence that residents or residues from the old Mubarak regime has still had power in Egypt and were undermining Morsi's presidency. At the same time, Morsi was acting too dictatorial for someone who had just been elected president. However, the Egyptian military obviously turned to Israel, not to Washington, for approval for the coup, because the Egyptian military has long collaborated with Israel in terms of the Gaza border. And so the closing of the Gaza border and accusing Hamas of being involved with the Muslim Brotherhood in trying to bring terrorism to Egypt is something to play into the hands of Israelis, who then will tell the American Israel lobby not to do anything to affect U.S. support for Egypt. So now, even though technically, legally, this was a coup, which stopped U.S. aid to Egypt automatically, the United States is not calling it a coup, and the neocons in Washington who claim to want democracy in the Middle East are all supporting the general al-Sisi and the coup. So the Palestinians have not been treated well by Egypt since 1979, the Camp David Treaty, and now the situation is probably worse than ever. But I don't know what's going to happen in Egypt, but I don't think the people who are out in the streets supporting the generals are going to be supporting the generals for very long. The masses are not always correct. And in this case, not being there is difficult to judge their sentiments, but I do have a certain understanding. I've been to the Middle East before, and I think that there were problems on both sides, but the way the military handled this and has handled it since, with the bloody attacks on unarmed demonstrators, the killing has all been one-sided. Egyptian soldiers have not been killed, but members of the Muslim Brotherhood have been killed, and in a way that really didn't take place under even Mubarak is outrageous. And yet it goes on, and it seems like a majority of Egyptians, or a great number of Egyptians, support that. So it's difficult to say exactly how it's going to turn out, but I don't think it's going to turn out well. The Arab Spring is turning into somewhat of a disaster, and it's more like a spring that has dried up, and we're due for more chaos in the Middle East than ever. You look at Syria, Jordan is unstable. Tunisia, we had assassination of a major opponent of the government. It's problematic. And then we have this farce called the peace talks. And the real problem is if you're going to have peace talks, you have to have a war that requires peace talks, and there is no war in Palestine as defined by any kind of definition of war. You have in the West Bank an occupying ethnic cleansing power, Israel. There is no armed resistance. There is no war being made against Israel or Israeli citizens. You have a situation where you see videos of Israeli soldiers casually walking through Palestinian villages, not wearing helmets, harassing, humiliating Palestinians, or arresting Palestinians, including young children, and there's no resistance to this. There's a Palestinian militia, the Palestinian Authority militia, which is trained by the United States in Jordan, which is there from the very beginning of Oslo, not to protect Palestinians from Israelis, but protect Israel from Palestinians. Even 2 years after Oslo, Arafat had set up special courts to try any Palestinian who would take up arms against Israel. And so you wonder, you have this Palestinian militia, and then you see all these video clips on YouTube of Israelis arresting Palestinians, and there's no one there to protect the Palestinians, yet there is this militia which just arrested dozens of people in the West Bank who were protesting this so-called farce called peace talks. And it's uncanny. It's kind of uncanny to me to see a farce like this go on with people debating whether or not this is going to finally be the time we're going to have peace. They talk about concessions on both sides. The fact of the matter is the Israelis and Palestinians are talking all the time, because in order to conduct security operations in the West Bank, they have to talk. And the Israelis have pronounced it a number of times how satisfied they are with the role of the Palestinian Authority militia in controlling the Palestinians from attacking Israel.
Jeff, let me ask you, why do you call it a farce? Why do you call the peace talks a farce? And why don't Americans view it as a farce?
Well, they don't have the information. They're told that there is this conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. There is a conflict, but it's mostly Israelis oppressing Palestinians. The average Israeli goes about his or her life every day without thinking about the occupation, without worrying about the occupation. In fact, Israel does not need any kind of arrangement with the Palestinians. They are doing very, very well economically as things are. What is new, however, is that the European Union has voted to implement a boycott against the West Bank, that they will have nothing to do with goods or products or the universities or anything that comes out of the West Bank. And this is something the Israelis cannot deal with or are afraid of. Matter of fact, stupidly, the Israelis are now not cooperating with members of the European Union who want to go into the West Bank come into Israel to deal with European problems. But what Netanyahu is hoping, that by getting into these prolonged talks over 9 months, the European Union will back off from from this boycott. So, in a sense, this is not being done by Netanyahu to really resolve the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but to get the Europeans off Israel's back. Netanyahu has promised has committed himself to build thousands of more settler homes while this is going on. The U.S. Kerry has said repeatedly, we have not pressured Israel to stop the settlement building. Well, this is like changing. You're playing for a board game. Let's say a board game, and while you're playing the game, your opponent keeps taking more and more of the board. And
Jeff, the Americans tell us that both sides should be willing to make compromises. And I want to know what you infer from this and what those compromises might look like, what compromises the Americans expect to be made, what compromises the Israelis might make, or what compromises most likely the Palestinians will have to make.
The compromise that the Palestinians would have to make, of course, is to put the right of return. UN Resolution 194, they would have to reject that, and this is something that Abbas legally cannot do. In fact, Abbas is not legally even a president anymore. His term expired in 2009, and he's it's a polite fiction that he's considered the president. There hasn't been a Palestinian election. His term was extended. Getting back to that is to let Israel have station troops maybe for indefinitely along the Jordan River, allow Palestine to be a Bantustan or set up in cantons, disconnected cantons. It's bound to fail. The concession Israel would make, I can't imagine what Israel would make that would be considered a concession that the Israeli cabinet or the political system operation, the leaders, his cabinet would go along with.
Now, Jeff, I want to ask one further question.
Yes.
Are negotiations even legitimate, theoretically speaking, as a means by which to try and solve this impasse, this injustice, this occupation? Because there is one party which is occupied and the other which is occupying. And the kind of 50-50 playground fight approach, is that the right way to do it? Forgetting for a second the biased mediator, are negotiations on this kind of 50-50 basis valid?
The negotiation between Israel and Palestine will not produce any solution that could, if a solution at all, it could be considered just. In fact, since 1967, there has been one apartheid state from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, and Israel has controlled every bit of that space on land, on the sea around it, and in the air, and nothing has changed. The Oslo Agreement, unfortunately, was probably an equivalent to a Nakba catastrophe for the Palestinians, because it gave Israel legitimacy over 60% of the West Bank, what they call Area C, and made illegal any armed resistance to the Israeli occupation, which otherwise under international law is legitimate. The only way that I see the situation can change, and I don't see that happening, frankly, I don't see even a tunnel to see a light through, is the international community sanctioning Israel the way South Africa was sanctioned. The Palestinian Authority should be dismantled. It has been a total failure from the very beginning. It is, as I say, it has served Israel. It has not served the Palestinians. And the international community has to force Israel to withdraw and even to have a solution that would be along South African lines. I don't see this happening. Is it possible that
these negotiations will actually produce something? I mean, we've seen the 100 Palestinian prisoners that are due to be released in 4 stages over the next few months, and the new pressure from the EU on Israel vis-à-vis the settlements, and perhaps the embarrassment that Obama would now go through if there wasn't something material which came out of these negotiations. Is it possible that, given the slight changes in the situation since the last round of peace talks, that something might just come out of this?
The odds against it are 1,000 to 1, and I would put up 1,000. I mean, something might come out, but it would certainly not be a solution, or even something that would end the struggle, because there's a limit to what a Palestinian Authority leader could give away, particularly since he has no credibility in the West Bank. I mean, I don't know any Palestinian who recognizes his legitimacy, and there may be some who, for business reasons, would do so, but I cannot see negotiations, especially when they're being overseen by a man like Martin Indyk, who is a former AIPAC employee and ran their think tank, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I don't see anything possible coming out of this. Well, this is John Kerry's efforts to make a name for himself, and then in the end, it's like having the rapist and the woman being raped sitting down to negotiate a solution so they'll both be happy. Israel should be in no position after cleansing Palestine in 1948 and then again in 1967, they immediately destroyed 3 Palestinian villages. 200,000 Palestinians fled to Jordan. So we had 200,000 more Palestinians out of the area into Jordan. For Israel to be able to be in the position to determine and demand concessions from people whose land they've stolen.
So you say the peace talks will garner absolutely nothing, and yet you also say that the international community must apply pressure, but the likelihood of the international community doing that is slim to none. Why is it slim to none?
Well, no, the international community is the chances of it happening to the South African degree is forestalled and prevented by the power of the American Jewish establishment over U.S. political process. The U.S. Congress is totally enthralled to Israel. Despite even Obama's objections, they just passed the most stringent draconian sanctions legislation against targeting Iran just the other day. That there's nothing that the United States government could do, or even the Europeans could do, that wouldn't be challenged by Washington, by Congress. You have members of Congress telling the Europeans they should put Hezbollah on the terrorist list. The U.S. Congress acts as Israel's Congress. Look, you have Chuck Hagel going for defense minister and Samantha Power being interviewed by the Senate Foreign Services Committee for their appointments, one to Defense Secretary and the other to UN Ambassador. What are they asked about? They're asked about how they support Israel. I mean, they're not asked about what they're going to do for the United States. The United States government is totally enthralled to the Israel lobby, and the U.S. role in the world is very powerful. Now, the Europeans get some spine, some backbone, and push sanctions because Israel is the biggest trading partner, or Europe is the biggest trading partner with Israel. That can have some pressure, but I really do not see any likelihood of any positive future for the Palestinians at this point in time because of Israel's power in the United States. If that power in the United States was broken, then Israel would be forced to make some kind of a deal. But
so, Jeff, what's likely to happen? Do you think that there will be a stalemate at the end of the negotiations and most likely the Palestinians will be blamed? Or do you think something more pessimistic and cynical will arise, that there is actually an end to the agreements on a kind of consensus and that it just does the Palestinians no justice at all and that Israel wins from the negotiations by keeping settlement blocks and water resources and etc. in the West Bank, for example? How do you think that this is likely to play out?
With Israel annexing what they call Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank, at the very least, which includes the whole area along the Jordan Valley, and leaves the Palestinians with isolated cantons. This was an old Israeli plan, and the Palestinians would have some kind of autonomy. This is what is likely to happen, or Israel will just do nothing and continue the slow, what they call ethnic cleansing, forcing Palestinians economically to leave, to move, and so on, with the backing of the United States.
Okay, with that dose of reality, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to continue this conversation talking about more of the reality for Palestinians, despite the efforts of pro-Palestinian activists here in America. We'll be right back.
Refugees, it could be you and your family, forced from your home and your history.
We are the people, and this is
Playgrounds for Palestine is a non-for-profit 501c3 organization dedicated to upholding the Palestinians' child's rights to play. This is a right enshrined in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. We operate through a volunteer board and staff, the generosity of our supporters, and a lot of heart. To date, Playgrounds for Palestine has constructed 15 playgrounds in Palestine, as well as refugee camps in Lebanon and Syria. To contribute to this most worldly cause, please go to our website at www.playgroundsforpalestine.org or send a check to Playgrounds for Palestine, P.O. Box 559, Yardley, Pennsylvania 19067 at www.playgroundsforpalestine.org.
Hi, this is Kathleen Wells, the host of Palestine Today. And Harry Fear and I, guess what? We need you, the public, who is listening to KCAA's Palestine Today, to donate. We must pay for our airtime. We are volunteer hosts. Please go to my website, thekathleenwellsshow.com, click on the donate button, and donate to Palestine Today. Your generosity will help to keep the show on the air. Without it, we cannot keep the show on the air. So, no matter how small or how large, please make a donation. We need you, the public who's listening to Palestine Today, to make a contribution, to make a donation, to tell us, yes, that you like this show and you want Palestine Today to continue. So don't forget, thekathleenwellsshow.com. Make a donation. We're counting on you.
Are you fascinated by the Middle East, but worried that U.S. foreign policy may lead yet to another war? Do you care about civil rights? For the past 30 years, the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs has brought its readers the real news, minus the corporate media spin. Read about Palestinians trying to survive the world's largest occupation. Learn how your hard-earned tax dollars fund that illegal occupation. Find out how much your members of Congress has received from pro-Israel PACs, and much, much more. Visit the Washington Report's website, www.wrmea.org, or call 888-881 5861 to request a free sample copy. Better yet, subscribe. It's only $29 for 9 issues. Mention Palestine today and get a bonus gift.
KCAA Radio, Loma Linda, where no listener is ever left behind.
So many years of catastrophe, more than 6 million refugees. It could be you and your family, forced from your home and your history.
We are the people, and this is our time. Stand up, sing out for Palestine.
Welcome back. This is Palestine Today. I'm your host, Kathleen Wells, and my co-host is Harry Fear, British journalist Harry Fear, who is in Egypt. And also our guest right now is Jeff Blankfort, who is a Middle East analyst, and he has his own show on KZYX, the public radio station of Mendocino County. He's a Middle East analyst and expert. And we were just talking about the fact that basically it doesn't look good for the Palestinians. It doesn't look good. The international community must do something to change something, because the peace talks is a farce. That's the word that Jeff Blankfort has used, that these peace talks are a farce. So, the remedy is...
The remedy is for the Europeans to continue their sanctions on Israel, not just the West Bank settlements. And we need to do that here. We also have to recognize and deal with the power of the Israel lobby. Right now, unfortunately, most of the solidarity movement is bought into the myth that Israel is supported because it is an asset for the United States. Now, I know a number of ex-CIA people who disagree on a number of issues, but the one issue they do agree on is that Israel is a liability to the United States. And these folks have worked in the Middle East. They know a little bit more about this than a number of academics who peddle the myth of Israel being an asset. So we have to start dealing with members of Congress, particularly liberal members of Congress, who are progressive in every issue but Palestine. And they're progressive in every issue but Palestine because they're given a pass by the movement here, people here, who says, well, we can't have people good on every issue. But we would not have allowed members of Congress to say they support apartheid in South Africa, but they were good on every other issue. We also have the labor movement, which is unfortunately, the labor leadership here is part of the Israel lobby, has long been a cornerstone of the Israel lobby. We have the only labor federation in the world, the AFL-CIO, or AFL-CIA, as President George Bush Sr. once called them, the only one that supports Israel. The other union federations around the world have expressed their solidarity with the Palestinians, and not in the United States.
Jeff, what about Europe? I mean, with this pressure on the settlements, is it possible that Europe will move away from its ties with the U.S. in terms of its attitude towards Israel, and that we'll start to see some meaningful pressure from the EU, which may prevent the annexation, full-scale or proper annexation of the West Bank? Is there any glimmer of hope that the EU might actually pull through with something meaningful to restrict Israel in this way?
That's the only glimmer of hope we have. Actually, and there is a glimmer because all the polls show over the years that the people of Europe consider Israel to be the biggest threat to world peace. Now, they don't get propagandized like the American media here about Israel. I mean, it happened here according to a plan. It wasn't an accident that the media here is so totally pro-Israel. This country has been propagandized for very important reason. It was essential to let Israel continue to do what it's been doing. But the Europeans have a much more open society. You do have members of their parliaments and congresses and so on who do criticize Israel. The newspapers do run articles about Israel that do not appear in the American press. And as I say, there's no popular support. There's no equivalent of Christian Zionism in Europe. I mean, it just shows a level of stupidity in this country that the Europeans, fortunately, have not descended to. But so that is that is the only hope. I think Stephen Hawking's decision not to go to Israel for President Perez's 90th birthday celebration was a major victory. The most important action, or let's say boycott action, much more important than any entertainer, because he gave legitimacy to academics refusing to have anything to do with Israel. And that's very important. So
Jeff, what about the Palestinians from inside? You know very well the situation in the West Bank. If Israel tried to annex the West Bank in a more aggressive way than it already is doing, is there a likelihood of a widespread civil uprising in the West Bank, or an increased risk factor from violence emanating from Gaza? Is there actually a Palestinian pressure on Israel, or could there be, to stop it from further expanding its colonization and annexation of the West Bank?
I actually, I haven't been there in a few years. I've been to Lebanon more recently. But it seems that thanks to the Palestine Authority and thanks to the Palestine Authority militia, the West Bank has been largely pacified. When I see videos of Israeli soldiers with soft caps strolling casually along the streets of Palestinian villages, I'm astounded, because they couldn't do that years ago. They could never do that in Lebanon during their occupation of Lebanon. That, in the sense that the Palestinians have been pacified.
What about the inspiring examples in neighboring Egypt, though, for example, of citizens being happy to be mowed down by security forces to get their freedom? Could that be overcome? Are there any glimmers of hope that there might be a reactivation of civil society in the West Bank? I mean, at the moment, demonstrations are hundreds of people, not thousands or tens of thousands, which presumably would be the mass needed to see real attention and a real restriction on Israel's abilities. Is there any hope for something like that?
I don't think so. I'll tell you, the big chance that this thing could have been resolved, even with, I've never supported two states, but it was ever a possibility. It was after the 1987 Intifada, which surprised the world. It surprised Israel. It surprised Yasser Arafat. It surprised the Palestinians in the diaspora, who before 1987 were the most important Palestinians in the world. They were meeting their major organizations. They were the story, and suddenly you had Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank rising up and putting out a communique which said no voice above the voice of the uprising. And unfortunately, it seemed Yasser Arafat sabotaged that, and Oslo brought that to an end. At the Oslo Agreement, in which Abbas significantly was sent to Oslo to negotiate with the Israelis, and Arafat would not send any of a number of really bright Palestinian lawyers like Raja Shahada or Reza Sorani, and they didn't even publish the Oslo agreements in Arabic for quite a long time. So the Palestinians didn't even know how they had been sold out. And just after Oslo, the Egyptian feminist writer Nawal al-Saadawi was in San Francisco, and we had a meeting at an Arab bookstore, and she said it plainly, Arafat has agreed to become Israel's sheriff. Well, he didn't go. He actually did set up special courts to try Palestinian prisoners, to try Palestinians who were trying to attack Israel, but he didn't go as far, I guess, as Israel wanted. Abbas has gone much further. And
Jeff, we haven't really talked that much in this discussion about the situation in Gaza and the power of Hamas as a Palestinian faction. Do you see any real weight from the Hamas movement in Gaza in influencing the power dynamic vis-a-vis the PA, Hamas, and Israel?
Well, let me put it this way. Hamas has been compared to Hezbollah at times. There's no comparison there. And Hezbollah, I've seen in Lebanon, has the support of not only the Shia community but also the majority of Maronite Christians. They are much more open in their political dealings with the people than Hamas is in Palestine. Dissidents in Palestine have been harassed. There are a number of brilliant individuals in Gaza who we never hear of, who have played a role in Palestine's struggles over the years. Hamas runs a very tight ship. And frankly, when I hear people talking about the PA and Hamas getting together to reconcile, my feeling, not being a Palestinian, but from my experience in the struggle over 40 years, is they need a whole new leadership. I've met Palestinian leaders from the 70s in the back, and they were totally different. Notably, Ghassan Kanafani, the great Palestine artist, intellectual, writer, poet, who was assassinated by the Israelis in 1971. They were a different caliber than what we see in the West Bank and Gaza today. Whether they're PA or Hamas, it doesn't make any difference. I think the Palestinians have been badly led, and that's not an accident. This is Arafat could have been assassinated at any time by the Israelis if they had chosen to do that, but he needed to be kept alive so he could sign a deal like at Oslo, because nobody else could have gotten away with it. And even the way they ran this operation, Arafat was supposed to be a prisoner in Ramallah, and this was a myth as well. When I was in Ramallah, you walked by his compound, there were no Israeli soldiers. He could have come out at any time. But what would happen is every time the Palestinians who would have complained to Arafat, every time the Palestinians started to get active in protesting what was going on in the West Bank against the Palestine Authority, Israel would then threaten Arafat, and then the people would rally around Arafat. I kept watching this thing play out, and it was a very, very, very sad situation. The Palestinians have no international friends. The Egyptian people don't care about them. The people in Jordan, other than Palestinians, don't care about them. The people in Syria have their own problems. The Lebanese, the Hezbollah supports the Palestinians. But essentially, the Arab world has lived with this situation for years, and many people outside of Palestine say, well, what about these other Arab countries? We see in Egypt the Egyptian people, you probably saw it, either they don't care about Palestine or they're hostile to Palestinians.
You know, I've been asked that, I've been asked that before, where are the other Arab countries in support of Palestine, in support of the Palestinians? This is an unfortunate situation.
Well, you know what happened? Uniquely, all the different Arab countries financed their own group of Palestinian militias. And so they were odds. The Saudis had their own agenda, Kuwaitis, but essentially, and Gaddafi in Libya had his own agenda. And what happened is that you didn't have any kind of unified movement struggling against Israel. You had a divided movement where even two Marxist groups, the Democratic Front and the Popular Front, essentially had the same political positions, but they didn't talk to each other. They say one came out of a split with the other. This is very sad. This happens in every kind of movement, but you really have to be unified. And there are outsiders who find ways to break up this unity.
Yeah, so that old theory of divide and conquer works its magic again.
It works.
Yeah.
I watched this latest farce, and it is a farce, or we could call it the longest theater other than the Passion play, which they performed at Oberammergau. The peace process has been going on now for like more than 20 years, and what we have is Palestine in pieces. The Israelis, as they say, the majority of Israelis say they would support two-state solution, but the solution is a demilitarized Palestinian state, which is a precondition. Although the Israelis say no condition, it's a precondition. The Israelis will demand that they have the land along the Jordanian border. They will also demand that they have control over Israeli airspace. And, of course, the Palestinians will have no air force. They'll have no army. They'll have a militia that will be lightly armed and funded by the United States. Even if there was, let's say, a deal in which a Palestinian rump state, a little Bantustan, was set up, that state would be dependent on the United States and Israel. And for all those Palestinians who've given their lives and struggled for Palestine over the years, this should be the biggest disappointment of all. So the options for Palestinians today is simply one of survival.
Jeff, you talked about earlier the necessity for the international community and the international people to take part in BDS. You alluded to this. And I wondered if you could talk about, in the last 10 minutes of our show today, the successes of the BDS that you think have been significant. You mentioned one earlier. And secondly and finally, could you talk about the strategy that you think should be really practically adopted to maximize the success of BDS and to make sure that as much pressure is put on Israel and as soon as possible?
Well, there have been a number of companies that have pulled out of doing business with West Bank on all different kind of economic levels. Some the one company comes to mind. It's a number of, a number of companies have decided that it's simply who have been pressured by Palestinian activists have decided that that the benefits they're getting from dealing with the occupied territories is not worth it anymore. We have to up the grade, up the level to the point where dealing with Israel itself is not worth it anymore. So the European community, the European Union, which has just put these sanctions or boycott against products or anything coming out of the West Bank, this has to be pushed and pushed until it covers all of Israel. It's going to be very difficult to do, but there's no military solution to this problem. Israel has 200, 300 maybe atomic weapons. They have atomic weapons in their submarines as well. Even no American president has even the courage to even acknowledge that Israel has nuclear weapons. The American media doesn't talk about it. So there's no military solution. The solution that I see is pressure being brought on Israel economically to bring it economically to its knees and get many of the Jewish immigrants who came from the United States, Australia, South Africa, France, England, to go home, to go back, as Helen Thomas said, to go back where they came from, because they have no business being there. That an American Jew who never suffered discrimination in his or her life can go to Israel and immediately become a citizen in a land where the people who are born there cannot, that's immoral. And even though morality doesn't have much of a place in politics these days, that moral issue has to be stressed.
Well, I was listening to a program earlier this week where, and I've heard many Jewish people feel that they have a right to the land, historical, biblical right to the land of Israel.
Well, God is not a real estate agent. If you read the Old Testament, the ancient Hebrews created this God, and then they had the God choose them, and they had the God tell them that they could go to the land of Canaan for people who would never harm them and take their land. And this is what we're seeing today. We saw it today. We've seen in this last century. It happened in Palestine. There is a direct connection between the Old Testament and the state of Israel. And people try to say, well, Zionism has nothing to do with Judaism. Yeah, the truth is, the majority of Jews at one point were not Zionists, and did not believe in a Jewish state. They had an expression next year in Jerusalem, but it was more of a ritual at weddings. But the truth of the matter is that the majority of Jews in the world have never visited Israel, even those who can. When most American Jews decide where to go on a vacation, if they're going across the ocean, they go to Paris, they go to Spain, they go to Italy, they don't go to Israel. There's a hard core, however, that puts Israel first, and that's the problem for America. It's a problem for American politics, and for Americans, they have to look at what that segment is doing to our democracy, or what's left of our democracy. The control over Congress hurts us. We go into an Iraq war, they pushed it. The neocons, the whole collection of neocons pushed it. And since the Iraq war, the whole Jewish establishment has been pushing for a confrontation with Iran. And maybe, as I should say at the end, maybe Netanyahu has come to the table, supposedly, as part of an agreement with Washington to allow Israel to do something with Iran. We don't know that. There might have been some kind of a trade-off. This is toward the end of the program, but Iran cannot be discounted. There is a major push within the American Jewish establishment and Congress, which is more preoccupied with Iran than saving the American people and solving our economy, to have a war with Iran. Even with a new president coming into power into Iran today, they do not want to lessen the amount of sanctions. They want to increase the amount of sanctions. And at some point we may be in a war with Iran, and that would be not brought on by the Iranian people, but brought on by the Zionist lobby here in the United States and their pressure over Washington, their control over Washington. That's the sad situation. And that's what Americans have to deal for American interests, not for the Palestinians, not even for the Iranians, but for the well-being of this country. And when our needs are here, the Israeli lobby is standing on the other side of the barricades. They are the enemy. Hello?
Oh, hello. I mean, that's a profound, controversial statement. We've got, 2 more minutes? Do you have some last words? We have 3 minutes. Do you have last words, Harry?
Well, actually, the conclusion of our discussion is obviously a very cynical and pessimistic one, and it looks at not just the situation in Palestine with America and Israel, but also generally the Middle East and the general U.S. Foreign policy machine. And as much as that seems a totally insurmountable problem, that should hopefully give us the energy to actually start participating in a more strategic and more energetic way to see that there is some justice brought down upon the head of this hellish situation. And I hope that Palestine Today and the discussion today will help to activate some of the listeners to do something within their reach to see that the U.S. foreign policy can change, be that phoning senators or involving in petitions or demonstrations or visiting the occupied territories or whatever. I hope that people will wake up and do more. And as Jeff made clear, it's going to take a lot of people to do more to bring down some pressure on this occupation on Israel.
Well, I know your nature is optimistic, Harry. So when I talk to you, I feel optimistic about it. And when I talk to Jeff, I feel, oh, my God, it's dismal. So yeah, I'm just...
the truth of it, let me just say, I've been a pessimist for years. And if I had been an optimist, I would have been burned out long ago. So I don't have great expectations, but outrage keeps me going. And I want American people to be outraged about what's going on, whether it's Trayvon Martin verdict, which outraged me, as I know it outraged you. Mm-hmm. With the Bradley Manning verdict, outraged me, outraged you. With the situation of Edward Snowden, I think actually very quick. Well, it's too late to get into, but all these embassy closings might have to do with pretending that Edward Snowden was actually uncovering something that was really important that should have been uncovered. This might be just a game that the government's playing with the closing of the embassies. Mm. But in any case, I think people just have to keep on plugging, but they should read the news and get mad because an outraged citizenry is the only thing that's going to change this country. We need change. Yes,
I agree with you. Listen, Americans, we must be outraged. We must be outraged over everything that is taking place in America today. The Trayvon Martin verdict, the Israel-Palestine issue, Snowden, Bradley Manning, on and on. Did I miss anything?
Detroit.
Yeah, you missed the fact that it cannot just be outrage, but it must be outrage that manifests in action.
I agree completely, Harry.
Okay.
Outrage lead to action. Yeah, not just screaming, but actually organizing and getting in the face of your member of Congress politely, but not backing off. This is your representative. Go tell her or him what you think that he or she should be doing.
Fantastic. Well, we had a wonderful show today. Thank you, Jeff Blankfort, who has his radio program at KZXY.
Why, KZYX?
Why do I keep doing that?
These acronyms are so amusing to a British third party like me. I don't know what any of them mean, but it's very entertaining.
543 KZYX. Thank you, Jeff Blankfort. Thank you, Harry Fear. We'll see you next week.
You're both. Take care. Both of you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Oh, my gosh.
You're on board KCAA's Inland Talk Express. KCAA, Loma Linda, 1050 a.m., the station that leaves no listener behind.
From the KCAA Weather Center, I'm Chris Earl Phillips. For this afternoon, sunny and a high of 92. Tonight, mostly clear, low around 65. Tomorrow, sunny and a high of 93. Tomorrow night, mostly clear, low of 66. Heading into the work week we started on Monday with sunny skies and a high of 93. Monday night, mostly clear, low around 64. On Tuesday, sunny and hot and a high near 92. Tuesday night, clear, low around 64. Wednesday, sunny with a high of 90. That's your weather forecast for this hour from the station that leaves no listener behind. NBC News Radio, AM 1050 KCAA.
This is the KCAA Community Calendar. Knott's Family Agency hosts their annual Summer Soiree Jazz and Wine Tasting Under the Stars at Edwards Mansion in Redlands on Saturday, August 17th at 7 p.m. Tickets are $40 per person. Knott's Family Agency works with the Department of Children and Family Services, both in San Bernardino and Riverside, to identify homes and families for foster children of all ages. Proceeds will help local foster children experience cultural enrichment in activities such as sports, book clubs, music lessons, music festivals, trips to museums and art galleries. That's the Knott's Family Agency annual Summer Soiree Jazz and Wine Tasting Under the Stars, Saturday, August 17th at 7 p.m. at the Edwards Mansion in Redlands. For more information, please call